Hi guys, and welcome to the video on the factors that cause changes to the exchange rate. It's a pretty tricky concept here, so we're going to split the exchange rate stuff into two videos. What we're going to start with is we've got the concept of the exchange rate, as you can see here, which is essentially where one currency is exchanged for another, and the rate at which that is exchanged, which is essentially the price of that, which is what the exchange rate is. The focus of this particular video will be causes and changes to the exchange rate. And you'll see here it's a bit grayed out that in a future video we're going to do a separate video on, okay, well, when the exchange rate changes, what is the effect on other things? But for the purposes of this video, it's the things that are going to cause a change to the exchange rate. Now, there are a number of different ones listed in your study design, but the good news is it really is only two things that you really need to be aware of here, and those are the demand for Australian currency, which is AUD, and the supply for Australian currency. Though that is the core idea behind this on how the exchange rate changes is either the demand for Australian currency changes or the supply for Australian currency changes, and then therefore that's going to have a resultant change on the exchange rate. You'll see here I put underneath demand and supply here an extra little bit of information and to help you understand, well, who is it that demands Australian currency and who supplies it is underneath here. So it's always other countries who demand our dollars, okay? And I'm going to give you a little bit of a kind of trick to learn the demand and supply ideas here a little bit later on. But just try and have in the back of your mind that it's always other countries that demand Australian currency, and it's always us who supply it on the international stage. We're going to pick that apart in the next couple of videos. Sorry, a couple of slides. So the first one we're going to start with here is how changes to demand for Australian currency occur. All right, so we've got a situation here, and I'm just going to kind of lay out what's going on. So you've got obviously Australia over on this side, you've got China over on this side, and we've got this beautiful little rock. It's really beautiful. It's quite ugly actually, called coal that lots of other countries actually want to buy from us. China being one of those. Okay. But what China can't do, and I'll just exit out of the presentation for the moment, China can't just give us their Chinese currency in exchange for the coal because that currency is no good here. The manufacturers of coal can't then go and use that Chinese currency to pay their workers or buy machinery or anything like that. Okay, so that currency is no good. That has to stay in China. So what Chinese people who from China and businesses from China who want to buy Australian goods and services is they have to go into this thing that I'm going to call the foreign exchange. All right. Now, normally the bank just kind of does this automatically for you when there's international transactions, but I want you to try and think of this as a physical space. All right. I want you to try to think of that as a physical space. And when China wants to buy this coal from Australia, they take their Chinese currency into Australia, sell their Chinese currency, and in return buy some Australian currency. Okay, so that's kind of what I want you to imagine goes on in this transaction. So in this case, before the Chinese person goes into the foreign exchange office, there's, let's just say, $500 that the foreign exchange office has available to sell in the foreign exchange market. And currency is just like any other market, whether it be hot dogs or smartphones or whatever it might be. It's just another market where the price of the things within that market are controlled by the factors of supply and demand. So when the Chinese business goes into the foreign exchange office and sells the foreign exchange office their Chinese currency, and then they're going to buy the Australian currency, they're going to demand that currency. Okay, so buying is the same as demanding. And as you guys know, demand is driven by the behavior of consumers. So when they demand that currency, they're going to get that Australian currency that's now part of the foreign exchange, and then this Chinese business is then going to send that Australian currency to Australia, and in return they will get the coal. All right. Now let's have a look. Let's forget the Chinese currency for the moment because we don't really care for the purposes of this study what happens to the demand and supply of Chinese currency. We only care about Australian. Before this transaction, we had $500 available in the foreign exchange market of Australian currency. But now after this transaction, look how much is left. We've now got only $400 available in the foreign exchange market. And as you guys know, when there's less of something, it's more valuable. And so as a result, since there's less Australian currency available for all the international economic agents to trade with, it becomes more valuable, and therefore it's going to cause an appreciation in the value of the Australian exchange rate. Okay, so just try, it's why I want you to try and imagine this as a physical space, a physical office where money is coming and going from all different currencies, and just think, okay, if there's less Australian currency, then it will become more valuable, therefore appreciate in value. Or if there's more, it's going to depreciate in value for the same reasons that prices change in normal market economics with the ideas of surpluses and shortages. So let's now link that through to the study design, okay? So the study design specifically talks about specific variables that are going to change the value of the currency, okay? So, and as usual in these times, Troy's come to say hi. Hello. He's going to have to sit down now. He can neither demand nor supply Australian currency. He demands biscuits and cookies and laps. Okay, so here are the ones in the study design that we have to link through to changes to the exchange rate. All right? And what I've done over here is I've just assumed, this is just, I'm going to split them out into the demand. So this is where essentially currency leaves that foreign exchange office. Okay, so it can go the other way. Yeah, the demand for certain goods, and the demand for the currency can also fall, but we're just going to do one direction here, and it can go the other direction if you wanted to do a depreciation. So all of these scenarios will increase the demand for the AUD, do this, cause more money to leave the foreign exchange office, so then cause an appreciation of the AUD. So the first one from the study design, relative interest rates. So what this one means is the cost of borrowing money in Australia relative to other countries. So what's going to cause an appreciation of the Australian dollar? Well, when there is high Australian interest rates. So why is that? Because there's increased overseas investment. If we have high interest rates here, there are high rates of return. So lots of overseas investors are going to go to the foreign exchange office with their currency, sell that, and then they will demand the Australian currency so they can then invest that into the Australian market and chase these higher returns. So high AU interest rates relative to other countries will cause an appreciation of the exchange rate. Move on to the next one, demand for imports. This one should be relatively straightforward. This is the one we kind of did in the coal example before. If there's an increased demand for Australian exports, well, that means that there's going to be more customers from overseas markets going to the foreign exchange office and buying more Australian currency. It's going to be less scarce, so therefore it's going to appreciate the Australian dollar. Capital flows. This one relates to just the flow of money in and out of the country, usually driven by investment demand. So if there's favorable investment returns, which means businesses in Australia, for example, are doing really, really well, well then you're going to have a lot of investors in overseas markets wanting to sell whatever currency their current investments are in, let's say American investments, where then America isn't doing too well, and then buy Australian dollars at the foreign exchange office, so then they can chase those higher returns here in Australia. So capital flows here just refers to the flow of money. Terms of trade, this is where it gets a little bit trickier because terms of trade is one of those tricky concepts. But essentially, what's going to cause an appreciation of the exchange rate caused by terms of trade on the demand side? It's going to be an increased terms of trade from higher export prices. Now, what this means is, let's say before it cost our overseas customers $100 a tonne to buy coal, and they want to buy 1 tonne. Well, they're going to go in and demand $100 worth of Australian currency. But if the price of that 1 tonne goes up to $150 per tonne, well, they're going to need to demand an additional 50 Australian dollars for that, aren't they? So as a result, they're going to demand more Australian currency, and therefore the price of that currency will go up, causing an appreciation. And then finally, we've got relative rates of inflation. Don't mix this up with interest rates. A lot of students do this. Low Australian inflation will mean we are much more internationally competitive because we can pass on those lower cost of production into the form of lower prices, and therefore we can sell more stuff overseas. A lot of information here. Please feel free to go back over this a little bit slower if you need to, because we're going to move on to, oh, we're going to do a practice question. Sorry. All right, practice question. Explain the effect of an increasing terms of trade on the exchange rate. So I want you to pause the video here and have a go at a 3-mark plan at your answer to this one. Pause the video here and then the answer will come shortly. Okay, so your first link in the chain is going to be showing me that you understand something about this factor that's causing the change. And so in this case, it's terms of trade. So if you can show me in this answer that an increase in the price of exports relative to imports is going to increase terms of trade, you're going to get a mark for that. Secondly, the second mark in these questions is always about the demand and supply of the currency. Okay, so what's going to happen to the demand or supply? Well, we know if it's exports, then that's behavior of overseas people, and since it's behavior of overseas people, that relates to the demand for Australian currency. And if the price of our things go up, then people are going to have to go in and demand more currency. Therefore, there's an increase in demand for the AUD. And then the final link in the chain here, guys, is really, really easy. It's just what happens. Does it appreciate or depreciate? It's a really easy final link in the chain. All right, let's go on to supply. So changes to supply for Australian currency. So we're going to do a similar kind of exercise here, but it's the other way around. So here we've got China, who is making cars that we want to buy. Now, similarly, we can't just go into the foreign, we just can't go and give our Chinese business the Australian currency because that's no good in their market. So instead, we need to go in and supply our Australian currency and buy the Chinese currency so we can pay them to get our car. So after this transaction happens, we don't have $500 in the foreign exchange office. How much do we have? We have $600. Okay, so the supply of Australian currency in the foreign exchange market, which is what we're talking here, has increased. And as you guys know, when something is less scarce, it is less valuable. And so the price of that currency will fall, therefore cause a depreciation. All right, so let's go into what this means for the study design points. Okay, so relative interest rates. Actually, what I want you guys to do is pause the video here and you tell me we'll do the first one together, what will cause a depreciation of the Australian currency here. Okay, so we're going to do the first one together. So relative interest rates. So this has to cause Australians to go in with their Australian currency. Okay, so what's going to cause that? Well, if there's higher overseas interest rates than there are here. Because if there's higher relative returns overseas compared to here, well, we're not going to invest locally. We're going to take our money into the foreign exchange office, and then we are going to then exchange that for whatever foreign currency is getting us the higher return. So pause the video here and have a go at all of these other 4 on what will cause a depreciation of the Australian dollar, which is essentially, as you can see here, us taking our Australian currency into the foreign exchange market. All right, so I'm going to fly through these. So demand for imports is going to be increased demand for imports. If we're importing more, we need to go into that foreign exchange office more often. Capital flows, if money's going out because there's favourable returns elsewhere, that's going to cause a depreciation and an increase in supply. In terms of trade, if there are higher import prices, we're going to have to go in and hand over more of our currency when we're buying things that are more expensive. And then the final one, relative rates of inflation. When there's low overseas inflation, overseas companies are going to be much more competitive than Australian, so we're going to import more stuff. Practice question time. Explain the effect of a falling Australian interest rate on the exchange rate. Pause the video, have a go. Remember, your first mark is what's going on with the factor, demand or supply, and then your final mark is what happens to the currency. All right, you get a mark for saying the reason how it changes things. There's a lower rate of return for overseas investors, which then causes an increase in supply for Australian dollar because the overseas investors are selling their AU investments. And then therefore there's a depreciation of the exchange rate. All right, recap very, very quickly. Use the image of the foreign exchange kiosk to help you. Link to basic economic concepts of supply and demand. And here are the little hints to remember which is which. And for full marks, you have to talk about demand and supply of currency. If this wasn't clear, guys, feel free to go back over. Otherwise, happy learning.